So welcome everybody. My name is Terry Swartz-Russell, and I am the Director of Family and Adult Education at Temple Emmanuel. We're thrilled to see so many people, and we started a new program called TE Writes, where we have all these wonderful authors, many of whom are members of the congregation, and then we have friends of the congregation who also write books. So tonight we're going to let our friend Michelle Hubbard, who's a member of our congregation, who has a great connection to Julian Zelizar, our speaker for tonight, in conversation with Rabbi Michelle Robinson. So I'm going to hand it over to Michelle Hubbard. We won't get our Michelles mixed up. And take it away, Michelle, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Terry. I'm so happy to introduce Julian Zelizar. I see my friend Julian as a modern day Heschel. Instead of fire and brimstone to awaken us to the trauma of society, I see Julian as a public voice that helps heal our brokenness. With his calm, measured statements, just like his father, Julian helps us see the political landscape of today within the context of the broader American history. Like Heschel, Julian comes from a legacy of rabbis. I was lucky enough to grow up with his dad, Rabbi Gerald Zelizar, as my rabbi, and to whom, along with Julian's grandfather, Rabbi Nathan Zelizar, this book is dedicated. On the day Julian's dad was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary, his grandfather, Rabbi Nathan Zelizar, sat on the stage to receive an honorary degree alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Heschel watched from the crowd. Later, Heschel spoke at our childhood temple, Neve Shalom, in Metuchen, New Jersey, a few years before Julian's dad became the rabbi there. Julian's mother, Viviana Zelizar, is a sociologist at Princeton. They both teach together at Princeton, the only mother-son professors in Princeton's history. With more than an astonishing 22 books he has authored or edited, Julian has been teaching his students and the world about the American political landscape to help us more deeply understand our world today. He is a frequent commentator on CNN, NPR, and was seen this weekend on CBS Sunday Morning talking about his latest book that he edited, a look back on the presidency of Donald Trump that will be published this March, part of his ongoing series on the American presidency. In addition to staying true to the traditions of his parents, Julian and his beloved professor author Meg Jacobs have been referred to on CNN as a powerhouse couple. Not only are they both guides for us in the political public sphere, but together they are raising 4 children in a home with deeply Jewish values, not unlike our own Rabbi Michelle Robinson. 2 of Julian's children are currently students at Princeton University.
Of course.
More than all this, Julian is a mensch. He is a good guy, compassionate and caring. He truly epitomizes what Heschel referred to as a tree blossoming from his roots. It is my deep privilege and blessing to introduce you to my friend, Julian Zelizar.
Michelle, thank you for that gorgeous introduction. Julian, as Michelle so beautifully shared in her loving introduction, you come from a very esteemed lineage. Indeed, you dedicate your book to your grandfather and father, both great rabbis of their generations. Can you share with us as we begin a little bit about how they shaped you, especially in your appreciation for Jewish life in general and Heschel in particular?
Of course. And first, let me just thank everyone and Yeshua for having me. Thank you, Rabbi, for doing this. And Michelle, thanks for such a beautiful introduction like that. It's special from someone who's known me since, we were kids, to hear your thoughts. And I have another friend out there I see of the shul, Robert Finkel, who's one of my closest friends at college and since. So it's nice to be connected to the shul. So yes, I mean, this was a different kind of book than I usually do. I usually am writing about presidents and Congress, and this has a personal connection. It's dedicated to my father and grandfather, and both had impacts. I mean, obviously, being from a rabbinic family, gives you a different kind of feel and understanding of religion as an institution. It makes you more aware of the challenges that religious institutions and religious life face. It gives you a better sense of the power that religion can have for congregants in their relationship with the rabbi. So at that level, I think it gave me a different flavor as I matured of understanding what not just Judaism, frankly, but religion could ultimately be, and the kinds of struggles leaders and lay people have to go through to make this work. But it also, look, they both were at the Jewish Theological Seminary. They are products of an era of Judaism and conservative Judaism in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, where it was a really robust institution, JTS, and Jewish life in New York was really at a peak. It had become, in many ways, after World War II, the center of Jewish life. And my grandfather and father went through this, and I heard a lot of the figures in my book discussed over dinner. There were people I was familiar with. I didn't really know much about them. So I think when I dove into the archives and I tried to understand this world, there was a level of familiarity, which was incredibly helpful and probably gave me insights. And finally, look, both my grandfather and my father and all the rabbis of both their generations struggled with this question of what is the meaning and what is the place of religion in post-World War II modern life, both in the aftermath of the Holocaust, but also in a world where consumer goods and science and the universities were providing so much. I think leaders had to figure out, how do you make this relevant here in the States to people living with grand expectations and with different kinds of values? And all of this really informed my book. And finally, I'll conclude on this by saying, both in different ways were involved in politics. My grandfather, who was a rabbi in Columbus, Ohio, and then Florida, after he retired, he kept going and starting synagogues there. But he always had a component of his life where he was involved in civic issues. In Ohio, he was a prison chaplain and even went into the Ohio State Penitentiary during a riot when the governor asked him to do that. In Florida, he counseled prisoners or people who were arrested. He would drive around with the police later in his life, offer them counsel. My father, who was a different generation, was also very involved in different kinds of political questions, both when he was president of the Rabbinical Assembly and also as a pulpit congregant. So I'm always thinking of this relationship between religion and politics, in part because of my own lineage.
Wow, that's amazing. And speaking of politics and history, normally you're writing about history or politics. In fact, you've written quite a number of books on those topics. So can I ask you, why a book on Heschel now?
Fair question. What's a political historian like me doing writing a book about a rabbi like Heschel? And, you know, one is what we said when the press asked me, this is a series, the Jewish Live series. And part of what they tried to do is pair important figures with authors who don't automatically cover these kinds of subjects, but could put a figure in some kind of broader context. And the press asked me to do it for that reason. I've written a lot on the 1960s, on civil rights and the anti-war movement in previous books. And so when they asked me, and I think that was on their mind. Look, part of it was personal. I'm interested in American Jewish history. I haven't really written about it because of this personal connection. And he was just a perfect figure, someone I was familiar with and knew about to jump into this element of my own life as a historian, with someone who's quite inspirational and very meaningful to the Jewish community. And the other reason was, when I wrote a book a few years ago on Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, it covered many themes, but one issue that emerged as I wrote it was the role of religious organizations and religious leaders in the civil rights and anti-war movements. And not only the Black church, but also in the Midwest, all sorts of Jewish associations were part of the push to put pressure for civil rights legislation. And I moved on to other issues, like I wrote a book on Newt Gingrich. But that relationship really stuck in my mind. I thought it was fascinating, and I wanted to come back to it. So when the press said, hey, here's a project, I just jumped at it because it kind of connected both of these interests.
So, wow. So speaking of the civil rights moment in American history, this upcoming weekend, of course, is MLK Day weekend. Can you share with us a little bit about what you learned in your research and through writing this book about the relationship between the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Abraham Joshua Heschel, and help us understand not only its impact on our sense of the Jewish story through the Heschel side, but also on the broader American Jewish story?
It's an incredible relationship. By the time Heschel and King really meet each other, Heschel's already pretty well known, primarily as a writer, a theologian whose books were getting attention in places like Newsweek magazine and Time magazine. He had become quite prominent. He would speak at universities and synagogues, but King is having this interfaith conference in Chicago in January '63, bringing religious leaders to talk about the issue of race and religion. And he is connected with Heschel, who is asked to give a keynote speech. And this is where the relationship starts. And Heschel delivers one of the keynote speeches, and it's a very powerful speech about racism. It's really, Cornel West later would say, it's one of the strongest speeches by a white American about race that he's heard. And he basically says that if you are a racist, you can't be religious. And the idea that there were preachers and lay people who claimed to be deeply religious but yet accepted racism was a fundamental contradiction that couldn't be resolved. And he gives this really incredible speech. He calls racism blasphemy and Satanism. He gets a standing ovation. The press covers it. And King and him, because of that, they spend time together in Chicago, but then they form a relationship that will last until King's death. And there's many points in the book, in the last two chapters, where I talk about how important it was to both men. Heschel emerges as an important figure, certainly in civil rights, which is captured during one of the marches in Selma that he participates in. King speaks at several events, such as the ordination, but others in the Jewish community, even talks about issues like Soviet Jewry that Heschel is very focused on early on. And it culminates with their relationship during the Vietnam War, which is really quite powerful and people forget about. Heschel's the head of this small group of interfaith leaders who start very early to oppose the Vietnam War. And they're trying to bring legitimacy to the anti-war movement by having people of faith involved. And Heschel and this group are really part of what helped bring King in 1967 into this coalition and to speak publicly at the Riverside Church here in New York at an event that Heschel helped organize to come out against the war. So the relationship personally was important. I think it represented this kind of interfaith coalition that you saw in many progressive realms of politics at the time. It embodied the promise of Black-Jewish relations around social justice questions. And Heschel is obviously devastated when King is assassinated. And I don't think the importance of this relationship ever faded for him. And it was very important for King as well.
You know, when you begin in your prologue of this book, you speak about that famous photograph of the two of them marching side by side on that iconic march from Selma to Montgomery. And you wrote, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, with his long white beard and overflowing curly hair, walks arm in arm with prominent civil rights activists. And then you go on to name the dignitaries that were there. And Ad Khan, until there, you're basically describing what most of us think about when we think about Heschel and King together. But then you point out something that, although I have seen, and I'm sure so many of us have seen that photograph so many times over the course of our lives, you point out something I had never noticed. You point out that there is a shadow of a pole that appears as if they're just about to walk over it. And the moment I read it in your book, it's obvious when you look at that picture, you can see it right there. But I had never noticed it before. And I just had a question for you. What about that pole caught your interest? What do you think the metaphor of that pole is? Why did it speak to you, that shadow?
Yeah, and for you won't be able to see it well, but this is the image, everyone. Most of you have probably seen it that I'm talking about there. I don't know. It's like one of these photos I've seen a million times growing up. I caught it on walls, and as I wrote about the book, it actually started. I know I'm getting a little off topic, but it started. I had Shai Held, who is a really great rabbi who wrote a book about Heschel's theology and philosophy. I had him speak at Princeton, and we were having dinner. This is years ago. And we got in a whole conversation about that photograph and how iconic it had become. And how many photographs are there like that, that have that power and resonance when you see it. So in some ways, the photograph is another origin of the book. And when I wrote the book and I was writing that intro, I really looked hard at the photo in a way you don't often when you're familiar with an image. And there were all kinds of things I really caught this time, such as the nun who is in the line with Heschel, who, I mean, she has this look like she's jumping to something, it kind of with an exuberance about what's going on, even though the situation is fraught with danger and they're surrounded by incredibly hostile crowds. But that shadow, and I don't know, and no one knows exactly what it is, if it's coming off from a building, I don't know. It's just, they're moving somewhere. I mean, they have a clear sense of progress, even in this struggle. And I thought, for me, that's part of what made, King, Heschel, all of these leaders whose religion informed them, it gave them a certain kind of power in these difficult times and a vision of where they were going that some activists didn't have, frankly. It seemed hopeless. And so that line, whatever it is, I do think kind of pulls them all visually to what they were trying to achieve, which was ultimately a secular world committed to social justice, where faith helped kind of bring us there.
It's so powerful poetically, the idea of walking over that shadow into some place of greater action and hope. And thank you so much for opening my eyes to that shadow. You end your introduction and your acknowledgement section with a reflection on the pandemic and the intense social justice challenges of our time. And you say that for you, this made Heschel's teachings all the more relevant than even before. Can you share with us some examples of how so? How do you connect the shadows of their time with the shadows of our time?
It's a great question. And I had, done a lot of the research for the book, and I had written a draft before the pandemic, the year before in 2000, and I guess it was 18 and 19. And I had done a lot of work on it. And then the pandemic hit the following year, and our family kind of rented a place outside of the city where we all were. The kids were doing school online, and there we were in this surreal place, obviously comfortable, and we had what we needed. So there was no complaints, but watching the country go through this incredible crisis where there seemed to be no bottom, and there seemed to be no sense, even with the best and the brightest, of what happens next. And certainly having kids, even though our kids are older, and even their friends, where you're thinking, how do you explain this exactly? How do you explain that this can happen? As everyone, I'm sure, has gone through versions of that. It made me think more deeper about some of the questions and some of the gaps that Heschel saw very clearly that modernity couldn't answer, that even with the best science, bad things happen. He was haunted by not only the Holocaust, but by the nuclear bomb, which was for him a kind of nightmare of modernity, even though it's created by the best things in the world. So living through the pandemic, again, like many of us, gave these kinds of questions much more weight than they would have a year earlier when everything was running perfectly. Not perfectly, obviously, of great problems in American society, but the basics, the foundations seemed as they always were since I grew up, since Michelle and I knew each other in high school. Things were pretty much the same. And then they weren't. And so then these questions were magnified for me. And I think it shaped kind of part of the power of how I tried to write about it. And then obviously at the same time, George Floyd's murder takes place, the Black Lives Matter protests take place, and debates about race, which had obviously been going on for decades, but also within a shorter time span since about 2014, were front and center. And here I am writing about Heschel and King and their cohort, thinking about all these questions and dealing with how do we in American society, how are we in some ways imprisoned by racism? And how does that affect our relationships and our action? And so to write the book during kind of that year of quarantine when we were pretty isolated with these questions looming over me, I think, I don't know exactly how, but I am sure they informed my writing and my thinking for those final drafts.
Wow. Yeah, it's so powerful to think about the way in which so much of what Heschel was striving to help us overcome is still work that remains before us. I was so struck.
I'm going to jump
Please.
in. Sorry. I want one thing as you said that. I mean, there was another element of it in that, we have a pretty religious family, and we go to services, and Jewish rhythms and life are part of what we do. And our kids all went to Ramah. It's just part of our family. And during the pandemic, we continued to find ways, I remember, to try to stay connected. That was a hard loss, whether it was our, youngest kids not having their final year in Camp Ramah, or losing the synagogue as an institution. And I remember I wrote an article for this on Tablet. Once we were watching the Park Avenue services. This is the synagogue we go to in New York, and they did it virtually, did a great job. And during one service, they're doing the Torah service, and the cantor pulls out, the cantor and the rabbi are in the sanctuary by themselves, and the cantor pulls out this small Torah, which is a Torah of my grandfather that we keep at the synagogue. And they're doing the prayers. And this is a Torah that my grandfather, Nathan Zelizar, he received this when he was a chaplain in World War II and went to the Pacific. And he brought that with him to do services and to counsel. And for me, kind of some of the power of religion became so crystal clear. Here's this Torah my grandfather brought in World War II in a war against fascism. Here it's being used at the worst moment. It was like in April of the pandemic to kind of form connections with people again at a moment we all needed it very badly. And so here at the same time, I have my own opportunity to write about this incredibly inspirational person. That's another way in which I think the pandemic was quite important.
Wow, I have goosebumps listening. You quoted in your book Heschel saying, "I live in Auschwitz. Since Auschwitz, I have only one rule of thumb for what I say. Would it be acceptable to those who were burned there?" And you devote quite some time to speaking about the ways in which those years when he was at HUC and he was hearing all of the news of all those who had died in the Shoah and how that sort of shaped his soul. You also shared this incredible story about a rabbi's march where he got his first taste of activism. Could you unpack for us what you think the link is between this really deep pain of the Holocaust that he carried around in his own life and his activism?
Yeah, I mean, he's interesting in that he didn't often speak about the Holocaust after it happened, although there's hints of it in much of his writing. But there's this whole debate about scholars, how much did it influence what he did? But for me, it was pretty clear it had a huge effect. Just remember, this is someone who grew up in Warsaw, grew up in the Jewish community, comes from rabbinic lineage, and he leaves Warsaw to get ultimately a PhD in Berlin, at the University of Berlin in philosophy. He then is teaching for a little while in Frankfurt, and then he's kicked out by the Gestapo of Germany, and he's able to save himself through family connections and comes to the US in 1940 because the Hebrew Union College, a guy named Julian Morgenstern, who ran HUC, was trying to bring in Eastern European Jewish intellectuals, and he got a fellowship, saved his life. It's an amazing story, but his family remained behind. So during his years in Cincinnati from 1940 to 45, and before the March story, he saw a lot wiped out, and he followed the news all the time. I tell a story that before Shabbat, he would turn on his little transistor radio and he would let it play through the end of Shabbat because he wanted to hear the news of what was going on. So much it like burnt out the insides of the machine eventually. His mother and three sisters are killed and die as a result of different elements of World War II. So it's tragic at a personal level. During those years in Cincinnati, friends said he was wrestling, kind of depressed and sad, and really trying to kind of go through the most horrendous experience a person can go through, separated from their family. At the same time, the other part of the story of how it affects him is he becomes a little bit involved with kind of political activism. He spends his summers in New York, and he goes to one famous rally in Madison Square Garden where different prominent figures speak out and say we have to save Jewish refugees. And the rally itself is very inspiring to him, although when he returns to Cincinnati, he's sad because no one's actually doing anything. It was a rally that was followed through by very little, including American Jews. He was very critical that American Jews themselves were not seeing the urgency of what he knew was going on from his own family. And he participates in this Rabbis March, which is a fascinating protest. I hadn't really heard about it. And it's a group of about 400 rabbis. The person who brings him into this is a rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi in Cincinnati, who he's very close to. And it's a kind of group of traditional kind of what we'd call Orthodox rabbis. They go to Union Station, the train station in Washington, and they start marching through the streets. And the newspapers say it was kind of an odd visual to see. They meet with different legislators trying to say that something has to be done about Eastern European Jewry. They try to meet with President Roosevelt, but Roosevelt doesn't want to meet with him. He's been advised this group is not mainstream Jewish representatives, so don't meet with them. So he doesn't. I think they meet with Henry Wallace, who's sent out to speak with them. And then it ends at the Lincoln Memorial, where they sing traditional Jewish songs, sometimes to the tune of American songs, like the Star Spangled Banner, and they do the Mourner's Kaddish in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And he goes back to Cincinnati, but I really think that was kind of an important moment of activism for him, when him and people who were not, prominent figures in American life took to the streets and fought for the cause. And so the Holocaust, those 5 years, World War II, the Holocaust, both, I think had just a profound effect on him. And that quote you read, I think really is part of how he thought. I mean, he felt this obligation in terms of what he was doing, in part because he had seen the total atrocities of what racism, in this case, anti-Semitism, could do in the modern world. And I think it profoundly shaped him.
As a follow-up to that, would you be so kind as to read us on page 64, the bottom paragraph, which I thought you wrote so beautifully about this, and then I'll ask you a question about that.
So this is page 64, the Holocaust.
Yep.
The Holocaust posed a profound challenge to their deeply held beliefs. Germany, which was seen as a beacon of scientific inquiry and modern cosmopolitan culture, turned into a center of moral depravity and brutality. Heschel spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of this, wrestling with the question of whether and how Judaism and all religion could offer the key toward preventing this kind of mass injustice from rearing its head again.
So can you tell us, do you think that he found what he was looking for?
It's a very, very hard question, and it is a yes and no. Meaning, I do think by the time the 60s unfolds and he starts to become as much an activist as a scholar, he did find in the power of grassroots movement some of what he had been searching for. I mean, I think he was mesmerized by the Black church and the kind of spirit he found there. He was really taken by not just King, but many of the activists who he met who were taking to the streets to fight against the kinds of things that he was frustrated in the 40s American Jews had not been fighting and other people had not been fighting to prevent. Here was the response. Here was the response to that kind of racism that too often went unanswered. And same with the Vietnam War. He was quite radical on the war by the end of his life, and felt this wasn't just a wrong war, it was a brutal war. And he spoke not just about American soldiers, but the North Vietnamese. And it was just insanity for him that this was going on. But I think he also still found a good level of inspiration from being with huge crowds when they went to Washington who were not just sitting silently. And he would often say in these speeches, we can't do it to American Jews, kind of don't do today what we did in 1943. And I think the movements were the opposite of that. The no is by the end of his life, these problems were all still front and center. The war in Vietnam is still going on after years of protests. Racial problems and tensions are still unfolding. And he's asked about this in the final interview of his life. And if there's kind of a lament about how could you be so optimistic and how can you have all these beliefs? And look, Martin Luther King was assassinated a few years earlier and the war is going on. And he acknowledges it. And he says the direction of life isn't always progressive, but he remained an optimist. And he often said, despite, his kind of best inclination. So I do think that 60s is important as part of the answer to that problem that he really struggled with.
So that's the Heschel we normally see, Heschel the prophet, Heschel the optimist, Heschel the fighter for the religious roots of social justice. You bring out in your book a Heschel that we rarely hear spoken about, Heschel the immigrant. You very compellingly quote him on page 51 as saying, I was an immigrant, a refugee. No one listened to me. What can we learn from Heschel's immigrant experience that might speak to us today or that we should be mindful of today?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you picked up on that. It was very much on my mind. This is a classic immigrant story, his life. And I don't think we often, because of how prominent he becomes and kind of how integrated he's become as an icon in mainstream culture, to remember he had the traditional, not traditional, there is no traditional, but he is a kind of a genuine immigrant who came from a culture so different than ours and wrestled with what was his place and what was his role here. Part of that quote is, it's actually the frustration with no one listening to the urgency of doing something in Eastern Europe and realizing what he did in the end just wasn't having an effect and no one was listening to him. But look, his story is about someone, there's many stories, but one of the things Heschel tried to do was try to rebuild and recreate the beauty and the power that he saw, at least, in that older Eastern European world, translated into modern post-war America with its suburbs, automobiles, and color TVs. And he was not someone so insulated that he didn't understand what was going on in modern culture, but a lot of his writing, for sure, is an effort to kind of bring that older world and see what light could it throw on the problems Americans were facing here, to take that older world and say it offered paths in post-World War II religious life to infuse it with spirituality and with a kind of energy of faith that was lacking. And that's part of what immigration is about in very, different ways. He's a rabbi and a theologian, but that's the beauty of what immigrants have done in shaping our country and still do to this very day. And there's, you know, in his life, you also see the challenges, certainly the kind of inability to bring his own family over, and his concern and sadness about the lack of attention that Eastern European Jews were facing in a moment of horror and crisis is a warning for today, when I think some of those silences continue. And he almost didn't get here. I mean, he had an offer from HUC to have this fellowship, but it was incredibly hard to get a visa. The State Department was not easy. And it took a long time. He actually moves to London before he comes here, when he wasn't sure this was going to happen. So there's the positive kind of story of the immigrant and the contributions they make to our country. And there's the ongoing challenges and resistance, even in the worst of times, that our leaders often exhibit toward, you know, people we need, want, and should have a chance to be here.
I love how you bring together all these various aspects of that immigrant experience, both in terms of not being able to have the impact that you want and perhaps needing to be lifted up so that that can be heard. And also in terms of Heschel's own sense of authenticity, representing that old world as the immigrant as he did in our Jewish tradition. And he was not shy about criticizing liberal Judaism. And you bring that out in your book, and with a little bit of trepidation as a rabbi, I'm going to bring up this question because there's a theme that runs throughout your book about Heschel's critique of American rabbis and of American liberal congregations in general. And you write that even as rabbis offered up Heschel's Sabbath to their congregants, he didn't back down from his critique of their work. And you share a particularly biting critique that he had about preaching, and in particular about preaching the New York Times, right? Rabbis should preach in order to pray, not preach about the topic of the day. And so at some personal risk, I want to ask you if you think that he was successful at shifting the tone of American congregations, both in the day and now in our modern world. And if not, what do we have left to learn from Heschel?
Yeah, although many of us know him for civil rights in Vietnam, in some ways this critique and this debate in the Jewish world was really quite important to who he was. He was very critical, I mean, incredibly critical of the rabbinate. And remember, he's teaching at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where conservative rabbis are being trained. And there's a certain amount of tension that exists with him. And part of that is his view. And he gives this speech. He actually gives it at a rabbinical assembly convention, where he just blasts the modern rabbis of the suburbs, say they're, you know, busy giving these sermons that sound like New York Times op-eds and talking about the political questions of the day. He says also they're very focused on building beautiful social halls in the synagogues, but they're not concerned with prayer. They're not concerned with the inner life of the Jew. Is the synagogue, he said, the place where, you know, prayer will be buried. And that's not the exact quote, but it's a pretty powerful line. And he publishes this as a book. He gives that speech when Mordecai Kaplan is sitting in the audience. And this is a direct attack on another big figure at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Mordecai Kaplan, much more influential in many ways at the time, who really was interested in Jewish folkways and seeing the synagogue in the end as the salvation for American Judaism, and building a synagogue that fit modern Jewish needs, rather than just kind of keeping everything as is and hoping people followed the religion. So Heschel's involved in this debate with Kaplan and others, and it goes public. Like the papers cover that speech that he gives, and they quote him. And for his whole career, he doesn't stop that criticism. Even, forgive the long answer, it was so important to him. There's a moment when he's in Washington for it's actually when he goes to Selma for this march in March 1965. After marching a certain amount of miles, he and some other dignitaries basically were driven back to the airport to fly back. And he's driven home by a young Jewish man who says he's never been religious in his life. He has no connection to Judaism. And Heschel writes this in a diary. He tells Heschel, this young man says, I've never felt this connected to kind of Judaism after seeing you and being part of this protest. And Heschel says, this is how religious institutions need to think, how to connect the questions that matter to younger Jews. So he's always wrestling with this, and he always had this biting critique of rabbis. I think in his era, he didn't win. I mean, I think he was an outlier. I think the model of the suburban synagogue really wins out, and the focus is on institution building and creating institutions that fit and can be nestled into suburbia in a way that made sense. And when politics emerged, it still remained kind of sermon giving as part of what was happening. But over time, I think Heschel gained more resonance and became more influential because Jews are now wrestling with, was he right on some of these questions? And certainly since the 80s and 90s, there's more younger Jews right through today who are kind of thirsting for something that's more spiritually satisfying. They're asking the questions that Heschel warned would eventually be asked, kind of, why am I going to the synagogue? It's not enough just to have a beautiful place and tell us to go. And I think that's part of why in conservative Judaism, as you know, in the Sidurs and in many different prayer books, you'll see kind of inspirational quotes littered of Heschel on the sides, and in sermons, you'll often hear Heschel quoted for inspiration. So I think in the long run, he was on to something. It's fair to say his critique was much too tough. It's fair to say sometimes he didn't appreciate what the suburban rabbis were trying to do. But I do think there's something in that critique, if you read the work again, that, boy, it says a lot today of some of the questions religious leaders need to think about if they really want to answer all these Pew studies that talk about the kind of fissures that are sometimes happening between organizational Jewish life and the life of Jews.
Yeah, it's his preaching on that is really bedrock to what we've come to understand as our search for meaning and purpose. And one of the ways that you bring that out in your book is when you explore a phase in his life where he was doing depth theology, and sort of he lays out this idea of the human need to be needed. And he applies that to his own social justice work. Could you share with us a little bit about how you see, you put that conversation in your chapter about Selma. Could you speak to us about how you feel his depth theology and that human need to be needed speaks to our need to do social justice, and in his time and in our time?
Yeah, there's a part of his writing that's interesting, even before in the 50s, that is in some ways acknowledging the loneliness humans often feel. And one of his first big books is called Man Is Not Alone. It comes out in 1951. And I think he's often trying to answer this question of kind of not only how do humans connect to God, but how do you move beyond that feeling? And he acknowledges that could be a feeling in the world of isolation, of loneliness. And in his writing in the 50s, what he's trying to outline through his theology, whether one agrees with it or not, is the notion that through piety and through a truly spiritual life, humans have the ability to ultimately transcend their ego and to hear the voice of God, to hear the fury, to hear the passion, to hear the love of God. And if a person could do that, if a person, as my subtitle uses the phrase, can kind of put themselves in a moment where they have radical amazement of the world around them, they will be able to hear God and they will not be alone anymore. And this is kind of the nub of a lot of what he is writing. And I think that then translates into why, during that march in Selma, he feels that he's engaged in a spiritual process. He feels that he is connecting in a way where he is not alone, but he is not alone because he's part of a broader cause. And I think, boy, there was just a level of personal spiritual exuberance that he felt because of those theological questions, but as they translated into what he finally found in the 1960s as his calling in many ways.
And do you see that calling as responsive to his need to be needed, his need to do something that's a call, that's an answer to the call to the world?
It's a good question. That's a kind of level of psychological analysis, which is astute because, as you quoted earlier, he did feel in the 40s no one was listening to him. It's kind of interesting. And that was a response to seeing these bad problems and saying things about them, and no one was really doing anything. And so I'm sure there was an element of that. He was very close with his family, and he had some colleagues who he was very close with, like a guy named Wolf Kellman at the JTS. But I think nothing matched, certainly professionally, the power of this community that he found around him. And he became very close with certain anti-war religious leaders. He'd have them at his home. I have one story where they do Havdalah together in his apartment. He formed a very close relationship with Reinhold Niebuhr, who was one of the most important theologians of the era at the Union Theological Seminary. So I do think, he was writing in his theology about humans and their relationship with God, but I actually think in that 60s, he also did feel the power of connection to a group and to a movement.
Well, speaking of his social group and his friends, you briefly mentioned a friendship between Heschel and Buber on page 29 of your book, and you say that's despite their theological disagreements. Can you open up that friendship a little bit for us? What do you think they each gained from each other?
I mean, this comes early in his life. These years in Berlin are incredibly important for Heschel. It's really interesting. He comes from as traditional a background as you could imagine, but already in Warsaw, before he before he's friends with Buber and is in Berlin and Germany, he's always interested in the secular world around him. And what people forget about Warsaw, and it had this intense Hasidic Jewish world, but it also had this world of Jewish playwrights and poets and radical labor activists and labor Zionists. It was a city that was just bubbling with a certain kind of energy. And he's always has a pull toward that more intellectual, secular intellectual world as well. And so when he's in Berlin, his doctoral work is obviously incredibly important, but part of what he loves are all these connections that he's making to some of the greatest thinkers in the world. And Buber is someone he has a pretty close and contentious relationship with. Part of the tension with Heschel and Buber and many other philosophers who he meets is he believed that God was real. And he insisted that God was real. This was the premise of a lot of his theology, whereas a lot of them thought God was symbolic of something, or Buber was obviously enamored with the Hasidic tradition, but not quite as connected to Heschel's understanding of God. And so they have a pretty contentious relationship in a good way. But Buber respects him. Buber will ultimately help him get this position in 1938 in Frankfurt. And continue to be important through their life. So it symbolizes to me, or represented this kind of way in which Heschel transcended different realms of society in that era, from the philosophical intellectual to the deeply religious. And I'd say, and Buber, obviously, he was part of a movement that became very interested in Hasidic life. And famously, Buber wrote a lot about this and was trying to take this element of Eastern Jewish life that for a while, many people, many Jews in Germany wanted nothing to do with. It was seen as kind of weird and lower class and not, respectable. But then you had these intellectuals who saw something incredible in it, that there was this power and a genuine kind of commitment and devotion in that world that they wanted to be part of, that wasn't around in the world they were living in. And Heschel is interesting because here's this guy who comes out of that world. He's a living embodiment. He's the real thing, but he's also totally conversant in the most sophisticated, philosophical arguments of the time. So I think that was part of the attraction on Buber's side about Heschel.
Wow, it sounds like a very generative friendship.
Yeah, I think it was.
So I have one more question for now to ask you, and I'm going to ask anybody who has a question, who would like to chat me. So you can send it directly to my chat, and I'd be happy to curate some of those and ask your questions on your behalf. But before that, I'm going to ask my question here, which is, Julian, when we first spoke about this date, you suggested January 11th. Now, it turns out that January 11th is Heschel's birthday, and also apparently his bar mitzvah day back in 1920. And so I got to ask you, was that a coincidence that we landed on this date, or did you really intend us to meet on his birthday? And if so, what would you like us to take with us from that opportunity to learn about him on this day that he was born?
Well, I'd love to say it was intentional, and I thought, how better to commemorate this figure in Jewish life, but it wasn't. It was me looking at dates in my schedule and finding a date that works well. But it is a nice way to have this discussion. And as I outlined, for those of you who have a chance to read the book, I believe that this man's life offers so much to all of us living in 2022, that kind of on his birthday or beyond, I hope that American Jews can engage in what his life was about, even if their politics are very different, even if their own understanding of religion is more Mordechai Kaplan than Abraham Joshua Heschel. He just has very important parts of our tradition and legacy as part of his life that he offers, from really thinking hard about what does it mean to be a spiritually fulfilled Jew, someone who is pious. What does it mean to be a pious person in this world with so many problems? There's no one better than Heschel to wrestle with that kind of question. For those of us who are interested in these questions of how do we keep American Jews connected to Judaism. There's the admonitions he made, but there's also the writing. He wrote beautiful books, such as his book about the Sabbath in 1951, which is one of the best kind of explanations of why this day is so important and what it offers when we have so many other things we can do on Friday night and Saturday. You read this book and it kind of opens new ways of thinking about the just total beauty that the day can bring to us in the craziness and fast pace of our lives. And then obviously the social problems that he was fighting are all still very real. And as we discussed, I was writing this as the Black Lives Matter movement unfolded, and the questions he was railing against, such as racism and inequality. And he was very concerned about poverty and the condition of the aged in this country, and why we go to war and why we go to bad wars. Those are all questions that as American Jews, we need to be concerned. And he, unlike almost anyone else, connects Judaism. He is a religious Jew. His religion is most important to him. And then he connects it to the world around him. And today we need that desperately. And so it's a perfect time to look back at his life.
Oh, that's so beautiful. We have two questions here in the chat that really go together. The first question is, when Heschel was studying in Berlin, Joseph Soloveitchik and Menachem Schneerson all lived and studied there. Did the author, did you, uncover any information about whether Heschel encountered them there at that time? And then the second question that kind of leaps off of that takes the same idea and moves it into the future, which is to speak about Heschel's influence on on the well-known theologians of our time, like Rabbi Art Green, who is one of our neighbors, and other wonderful Jewish theologians of our time?
Yeah, I didn't find in the archives, and I might have missed it, but I did not find him meeting Soloveitchik there. He met many kind of important figures, like Leo Beck was someone he spent time with. And so that particular relationship I didn't find in Berlin. And Green is obviously kind of one of the great voices today. His writing was very helpful, not only for me in trying to understand some of what Heschel was working on, but also to see kind of how it connects to a body of writing today, which are trying to once again make relevant some of these traditions in contemporary times, which Green obviously is doing more than anyone. So that was very important as well.
Thank you. A beautiful question from Clark Hubbard. He asks about Heschel's father, and he said he's wondering about Heschel's father and his death in the influenza epidemic, and how that affected his relationship with God and the world. And if I can add on to that, from one pandemic to the next, right? What do we learn from that moment?
Yeah, I mean, his relationship to his father was very important. His father was training him until the time of his death to be a rabbi. He was giving him his rabbinic training. His father, according to his own recollections, had a big influence on how he thought about the world and about piety. His father, he said, was incredibly kind to people, incredibly kind to people who sought his counsel. And Heschel would remember that, and remember that kind of empathy that he had for people who were struggling. And I think that it stuck with him. I mean, I think he was a role model in that way. His father dying so young was a terrible tragedy, obviously, and it kind of resonates today with what many people have gone through and the losses people have found. And I think it was a kind of first big tragedy that he experiences. I mean, he had seen anti-Semitism as a young boy, and he was aware of kind of conflict, but having your father die at that age so suddenly was really traumatic. And then, you know, his uncle basically takes over tutoring him as a rabbi, and works with another rabbi who teach him a very different tradition, meaning his father had taught him the writings of the Baal Shem Tov and really focused on the kind of on piety and the beauty of every individual. And his training after his father's death turns to a darker side of human life. And so there was that effect as well. But obviously, and I know the one question I don't know, and I'll never know, is, you know, the interesting thing about Heschel is he will leave, you know, Warsaw. He didn't have to leave. In many ways, it would be more predictable he would stay. He was a brilliant young man. He was trained already as a rabbi, being kind of nurtured to remain and to become a central figure. And then he says, I want to go. And he goes first to Vilna, where he has to get secular high school education before going to Berlin. And it's not inevitable that this would happen. And I'm sure at some level, and again, I have no evidence of it, and who knows, but there must have been something with his father's death at some level that allowed him to disconnect in the end from that world. Maybe if his father had lived, it would not have been so easy. But again, that's pure speculation. But it was a big event. And look, it's a story. The losses, it's a very intimate, personal story of the impact of losses that are felt in these kinds of health moments, global health pandemics. And at that level, the most basic level, it's something that I think is quite important today.
Yeah, and the way that the trajectory of so many of our lives can change into unanticipated paths. Samuel Goldring asks about how alarmed was Heschel by contemporary threats to Jews over the world, particularly against the Jewish state?
So that's a good question. He's always alarmed by threats to Jews around the world. He's alarmed in the Holocaust. He's alarmed by anti-Semitism. When he's in Selma here, he is very cognizant of the anti-Semitic placards that are being waved around by the white mobs, which, use terrible language about Jews and Black Americans within a few lines. And so this is something he worries about all the time. Very early on, in the early 60s, he is one of the early figures who's talking about Soviet Jewry, and he's incredibly worried that once again, he says, the American Jewish community is missing what's going on as the Soviets are basically depriving Jews of their Judaism. He's involved in mobilizations in the early and mid 60s on this question. He talks about it with rabbis before there's really a movement. In the 70s, there'll be a huge movement, but it's not there yet. And he's an important voice. And if you read other early activists, they talk about Heschel. Elie Wiesel wrote a famous book about this question that helped put it on the map. And he credited Heschel for really awakening into this. And the two of them spoke about it. So at that level, he was concerned about what was happening to Jews in other parts of the world. And then with Israel, the key moment, I would say, is in 1967 with the war, and the war unfolds. He feels the same sense of crisis and terror that many Jews felt watching this unfold, and a real feeling that the state was at risk. And what did this mean, not just for the state, but for Judaism, if this was unsuccessful? And he, though, defends Israel and is not a pacifist, even if he's an anti-war activist, and believes that Israel had a right to do what it did. But many of his colleagues in the anti-war movement disagreed with him, and they were very critical of Israel for the territorial acquisitions. And they asked Heschel, they were kind of attacking him, saying, how can you criticize the US for doing this kind of stuff and you're silent on Israel? And there's a moment in 67 where the tensions are pretty great, including some of his closest friends. In the end, though, they don't create any permanent divide. He goes right back to the anti-war struggle, and they work together well, but he is worried about it. He writes a book about Israel, trying to offer an explanation of why the country was so important to Judaism. I'll end by saying on this very good question, early in the 40s, he's always a Zionist since he's young, but it's not the issue that defines a lot of what he does in the 50s and 60s. He's much more interested in these questions of piety and spirituality. He's much more interested over time in human rights and kind of how we as societies were treating each other and what kind of injustices we were allowing to happen, which is different than kind of American Jewish life, certainly in recent decades, where Israel becomes the fissure or the fault line of political debate. He wasn't part of that. And then the second part, which I thought was interesting, is the way he saw the importance of Israel is not just as a state or even in terms of Jewish nationalism. It was much more, he saw this long-term connection, integral connection of Israel to Judaism as a religion, and why that land had always been so important. And even in that book he wrote, he saw it at some level as also part of the answer to these questions that he had been talking about, that Jerusalem had the possibility for the kind of reconciliation and life that didn't exist anymore. I mean, that was the promise. I mean, Israel in some ways was the antithesis in his mind of the Holocaust. It was a response to it. It was the globe saying, this is making things right. And so his vision of Israel was very robust in that way. I found it fascinating to kind of read through him on this question.
Wow. Yeah, we have a couple of questions that have come in as you've been talking about how he changed the world in terms of interfaith work. You speak about that sense of that Jerusalem could be something better, something different, something more. he had relations in terms of Vatican I, Vatican II, and the shift within the Catholic world. How much of that is attributable to him and his sort of philosophical influence, and how much of it just sort of was going on a different track?
Well, interfaith relations were essential to him. And I think especially over time, and he's criticized for this. I mean, there were critics of his who said he was too interested in interfaith relations as opposed to his own relations and the dialogue within the Jewish community. But he saw this at many levels as being a very powerful foundation for a vigorous religious life in this country. His friendship with Niebuhr, as I said, in the 50s, Niebuhr gave one of the first big good reviews to one of his books in the New York Herald. That relationship, I think, helped him see the commonality of some of the debates that theologians of all religions were having about the relationship with God and man, which was the issue that consumed him. And in some ways, that was as important as halakha, as the Jewish law, which was so distinct. But when you shifted to this bigger relationship, other religions were involved in that dialogue. And I think he saw that. I think in his politics, he really saw, especially with Vietnam, but also with civil rights, what interfaith cooperation could do. It wielded a power on the public stage that was unequaled by many other kinds of activism. And I think, you know, when he turns to Vietnam, it was natural that he wanted to do it not simply with fellow Jews, but with leaders like William Sloane Coffin and John Bennett, and kind of different faith leaders. And the Vatican, too, is a really interesting story. I have it in the book, where the Vatican, for those who don't know, essentially decides to revisit key doctrine and go through this process. And they're interested in doctrine that in the wake of the Holocaust, in the wake of the rebellion against colonialism, had been problematic. And that includes anti-Semitism and how Jews are treated. And this is a big moment between 62 and 65 that the Vatican undertakes this process. And Heschel becomes involved in that dialogue. He's brought in secretly as a representative to meet with high-level Vatican officials. And over several years, he writes a huge memo, kind of going through the key areas where Catholic doctrine has been at the core of anti-Semitic rhetoric and thought over the decades. He goes through these really tough negotiations where the Vatican is watering some of this down, and he's very insistent that they don't. It culminates in 65 with progress, with progress on these questions. But he's criticized when it becomes public he was doing this. He's criticized. Some are critical. Why Heschel? Why is he the voice of Judaism? But others, like Soloveitchik and others, they're not comfortable with a Jewish leader talking with the Vatican about theology. It wasn't what you were supposed to do. But Heschel didn't desist. He really believed that this was so important to creating, frankly, a better world, that I think it's really a powerful legacy of his that I hope has a foundation in modern times.
Yeah, so he was really intimately involved in shaping that doctrine. That's amazing. One last question from people who are joining us, and then mindful that 9 o'clock is coming soon, I have one final question after that. So the question that we have in the chat is actually about your own sense. You are a father, you're a parent, you're also a professor. When should we start teaching Heschel's texts, the questioner wants to know, to our children? And he actually writes, you know, his deep and complicated philosophies, of course, cannot be understood by young children and teens and young adults sometimes. But how can introduction of the concepts be transmitted to young people before they, quote, drop out? How do we get them a little Heschel before they leave our Jewish tradition?
I mean, the great thing about Heschel is young. I think you can start with younger kids. The thing about Heschel is he wrote in poetic ways. It's quite beautiful the way he wrote. Even if his writing, some of his books are incredibly difficult to follow, like God in Search of Man is not an easy read. It's not a read for young kids, but there are lines there, which are often the lines that are in the Sidurs, that I think for young people are an introduction to think about some of these questions about responsibility, about piety, in ways that are accessible. You could pull parts out of Heschel at a young age. And I think there's no reason not to start in Hebrew schools when, we're trying to teach kids at that level just how to get interested in why this matters at all. And you're getting ready for your bar or bat mitzvah, and you're trying to say, like, why am I doing this? And I think Heschel is great. And then I think in high school and college, I do think you can use some of his texts. I think, he wrote a great book about The Earth is the Lord's, about Eastern Europe and the lost world of Eastern European Jewry, it's not hard to read at all. It's a short book. It's written like a poem. It's almost a eulogy to a lost world. The book on the Sabbath, very short. A lot of it isn't so hard to follow. And so I think, through high school, I think kids should already be exposed to some Heschel. I think it would be great if it became part of his writing, became part of the Jewish curriculum. And I wouldn't say don't teach his activism, because he wouldn't want that. And again, kids come different political perspectives, but the idea that there are these strong connections between one's religious values and faith and what you do in the world are so important that Heschel's a great person to teach that through. So I hope Heschel can come back in that way. I think he offers a lot. And I just when the book came out, I did a little older, I did it at the Princeton Hillel. I did like a Shabbaton with the students, and we had hundreds of students came. This was in the gap of normality that we had in the fall. And it was great. The students were so excited to talk about some of these questions, and not just the Selma and the anti-war stuff. They wanted to know about God in Search of Man, and they wanted to understand more on the Sabbath. And you could see by the end of the weekend, I had lots of students who were just excited about the kinds of questions college students often are not discussing, and thinking about Judaism in deeper ways. So I'm all in on bringing Heschel for our younger generations.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. It's wonderful. One question snuck in that's so good that I just have to ask it before my final question, which is Heschel, in your opinion, a prophet with a capital P?
Yeah, I'm asked that. People say he thought of himself as a prophet. He wrote, we didn't talk about his book, The Prophets. I don't know. He also, he was someone who thought well of his ideas, and he was a strong intellect, but he was also humble in his writings and understanding of humanity. And do I think he was a prophet? I don't know. I can't really answer that question, but I think he understood the prophetic language. I think he had an interpretation of the prophets as people who were essentially raging about the things we were all indifferent to, but that God would obviously see as horrendous in the world. And he understood it at that level. And I do think he brought his entire life to a level of spiritual radical amazement that he wrote about. I think he found that at some level by the end of his life. I don't know if he was a prophet with a capital P, but few people were as intimately connected to that tradition and lived it in a way that he did.
Thank you. All right. Well, I've got to say, this is a must read for all of you who are here. Run, don't walk, buy this. It's a great book. And I would like to ask you, Julian, if you could please end on page 236 with the final paragraph. I'd love if you could read us your final paragraph. It's not a spoiler here to the book. It's still well worth reading. But if you could read us how you conclude.
Of course. Like the Hebrew prophets, Heschel tried to answer the spiritual crisis facing the modern world. He saw politics in moral terms. The emptiness of our souls was directly connected to the violence all around us. Jews needed to open themselves up to the radical amazement of accepting the reality of the divine and living a life where every action was informed by religious values. That will remain his clarion call to action until the terrible wrongs, as Heschel called them, are wiped away, when crass materialism, social injustice, and unnecessary military force claiming the powerful hold they still have on our society.
So here's my final question for you. Why did you choose to end there? And what, in your eyes, is Heschel's clarion call to us today?
His clarion call is to, as each individual, to be spiritual and be pious in a way that makes us see how much we have to do to heal the world around us. And that's ultimately where radical amazement will lead us. And his clarion call was to do that. He did it. He lived his life that way toward the last decade. And I think we need more people who can achieve that same state of mind, given all the problems we face. And I wanted to end it with the kind of message I could imagine Heschel would be articulating in our current times.
Well, I say amen to that. And thank you so much for
Thank you,
helping
everyone.
us to learn more about Heschel and to hear Heschel's clarion call to us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Stay healthy.
Laila Tov Lekulam.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.